hello to our viewers. We are currently in the television studio of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, and our guest in the studio is Professor Maria Coady. Maria Coady is a professor of bilingual education and ESOL at the University of Florida College of Education. And she is currently visiting Poznań as Fulbright Distinguished Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences. So let us begin with some basic terms. Maria, what is ESOL?
Hi, good morning. Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So ESOL stands for English to Speakers of Other Languages. And this terminology is used in the United States pretty interchangeably with ESL, English as a Second Language.
Right, so in Europe we know very well what ESL is. And so who are the speakers of other languages? Who are the multilingual students in Florida schools?
Right. So Florida has about 300,000 English learners, or those are students who are identified receiving special services for English language development. So there are about 300,000 kindergarten through grade 12 in the school system in Florida, just in Florida. Across the United States, the number is about 5 million. So we have a large multilingual population in the United States and a growing number demographically across the entire country.
So within the school system, these are the students who receive some language assistance or English as a second language instruction?
Yes, those are students who, again, are identified using assessment practices to determine that they need English language learner services. And they should be, under American law, they're provided access to those services under the U.S. regulations.
Mm-hmm. So this means that when they enter the school system, the language needs evaluated first.
Yes, so legally in the United States, when a new student signs up for or is enrolled in school, it's the school's responsibility to determine if the student is in need of English learner services, special services for English language development. So the schools have a short period of time when they need to formally evaluate the English language ability of students in order to ensure that they receive the services they're entitled to under the law.
And what kind of services can they receive?
Right, so this is a wide variety of services that we have across the United States. And much of it is state-specific. So for example, I come from the state of Florida. And in the state of Florida, we have very specific state regulations that allow all English learner students to receive services in a regular classroom. In other words, teachers in the state of Florida have a legal obligation to be prepared to differentiate their instruction for English learners. But that's a very different situation, for instance, than another state that might not have those requirements. I can also say that there's a wide variety of program types in the United States, ranging from what I just mentioned, what we call an inclusive classroom, where a teacher would differentiate her instruction, all the way to developmental bilingual or two-way bilingual education programs. So there are a variety of services and program models that students can access.
So this is a wide variety. There are differences between the states. And is it possible that some state would not provide any services at all?
Well, theoretically, no services would be a violation of several national laws and regulations under the U.S. Department of Education. So doing nothing, if you would, just a student who came in, let's imagine an immigrant student who arrived in third grade in a primary school classroom, If that student were put into the classroom without some kind of differentiated services, we would consider that submersion in education, and that would violate the United States law. So you can't not do anything in the United States. However, I should qualify that and say that sometimes what we see in inclusion classrooms is teachers might not be prepared or understand how to differentiate their instruction, their materials, their assessment practices. And so in theory, they should be doing that, but if they don't, it would really violate the law. It's a very fine line in an inclusion classroom.
Okay, so to make things clear, submersion is illegal, so the schools cannot just not do anything, okay? They have to do something. And the other problem, probably like anywhere else in the world, is the practicalities of teacher education. And so some teachers may be better prepared to deal with these classroom realities than others. Okay. So you've said that, well, first of all, the student has to be evaluated, which means that the student's proficiency in English will be evaluated, I guess, together with other educational needs.
Yes.
Okay. And then you say there's a variety of different programs. We have a chart prepared that we want to show to our viewers. So what are those different programs?
Well, so students, if they're in a mainstream classroom, like in Florida, they would go into a regular classroom where a teacher could have students that are multilingual or English learners. They could have students with with disabilities. They could have students who are gifted and talented. And in an inclusion classroom, that's a lot of work for a teacher. You really have to be very well prepared to differentiate your instruction for all of those students' learning needs. So that's a very tall task, if you would, for teachers to do that. We also have programs that are very strong programs and 35 years of research, such as dual language or two-way immersion bilingual education programs that are very effective. Again, with some qualification, highly prepared teachers who understand the process of second language teaching and learning and multilingualism, who also understand the resource base of a school. And ideally, I always think for multilingual students, ideally, we want multilingual teachers. And so this really, I think, facilitates learning for multilingual learners overall.
So one possibility is the inclusion classroom, like a mainstream classroom for students with different educational needs. And on the other end, we have dual language or two-way immersion programs. And you wrote a book on the Coral Way bilingual program. Could you tell us, please, what is this Coral Way bilingual program about?
Sure. Yeah. So this is quite a story. The Coral Way bilingual program. It is the Coral Way bilingual program is actually a school called Coral Way Elementary School that still exists today in Miami, Florida, and it was really the first publicly funded two-way immersion bilingual education program in 1960, 61, 62 with the socio-political context of Cuban refugee children who came to the United States following Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba. The program is fascinating because it was really in 1963 a true experiment. Back in the 1960s in the United States, we had the civil rights movement. There was a lot of political and social questions about the legal rights of minoritized students, racially minoritized, linguistically minoritized students, and lots of questions about social justice and equity. The Coral Way bilingual program was actually the result of a grant that was written by a woman named Pauline Rojas, who received some funding from the Ford Foundation. And again, it was an experiment. Back then in 1963, the educators did not know if students were educated through the medium of two different languages, how they would do. I mean, we really didn't know, would they, if they learned social studies in Spanish, could they still pass a test in English, and vice versa? If they learned mathematics in English, would they be able to understand that in Spanish? And it was, again, a true experiment. There was one research study that we have access to today, that resulted from this experiment, and it showed the learning gains for two groups of students, Spanish speakers and English speakers, both learning through the medium of Spanish and English in the program.
So this was a regular elementary school for the children, well, all children from the neighborhood, right?
Yes.
And it so happened that those were both mostly Cuban refugees and native English-speaking students?
Yes.
And how did the instruction look like?
Right, that's a key question, because we know that if you have inclusion classrooms, or you have what you see on the chart, educational programs where you actually pull students out of a class, or you push in, you bring instructional support in, or you have different bilingual programs, we know the quality of these programs and the educational success of students in the programs is really dependent on the preparation and education of those educators. And I mean teachers, para-educators, leaders like principals, school counselors. Really high quality preparation makes a difference. So in the Coral Way program, again, this was an experiment, but part of the funding that came from the Ford Foundation in 1962 was targeted, earmarked for summer preparation for English-speaking teachers as well as Spanish-speaking teachers, most of whom came from Cuba and were already highly educated. Several had PhDs in linguistics already, So they were well educated themselves, but the funding in the summer to prepare them to work for those children was used to develop materials, to talk about bilingual instructional practices, to share ideas for students, to build language across the curriculum for both groups of students. So it was a key component in the success of the program.
Okay, so once again we have the factor of teacher preparation. So it's not just an inborn skill that you come into a classroom with. You have to prepare to deal with a multilingual student. And talking about Coral Way, then what would a typical classroom in an immersion program like this look like?
Well, in 1963, the programs looked different than a two-way immersion, or we call dual language program, would look today. So I'll talk about both. So first in 1963, in this experimental mode, the teachers and the leaders decided that they would place students in the morning, in a classroom that was in their native language. So native English speakers would have some instruction in the morning in English, and the native Spanish-speaking students would have some instruction as a separate group, right, in their language. And right around the middle of the school day, the students would interact. So you can see that the students were really linguistically separated. Now, there was a lot of caveats to that. It was very imperfect in the way they determined what students' first language was. It was very imperfect. But the middle of the day, students came together in sort of a very loose kind of playground interaction. And in the afternoon, they switched. During the time in the middle of the day when the students interacted, the teachers also had co-planning time. And this seemed to be a key element in the program, where there was time set aside for educators in a bilingual program to really think about the language development in both languages across the curriculum for different students. And again, that's really important. So early on in this experiment, you see a separation of students based on loosely what their first language was, and then in the instructional practices. Today, however, we fast forward 50 years, we've learned a lot about bilingual education programs. We've learned a lot about two-way immersion and one-way immersion programs. And two-way immersion programs or dual language programs today, you would have very strategic and you would have careful placement of students irrespective of their first language. You would think about integrating those groups of speakers from the beginning. They would not be separated linguistically. And there would be a lot of attention paid to the first language oracy of students. Theoretically, the teachers would know a lot about students' home literacy practices and their literacy abilities in multiple languages. And I think that's the ideal, right? We have, when teachers and leaders understand the different language and literacy abilities of students, then they can really target their instruction to build on what students already know and bring them to the next level. So the programs 50 years ago looked different than the programs do today, and I suspect they might, and I can see how, they might continue to evolve in the next decade or so.
But still, the idea is that both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking students learn both languages.
Yes, the key is that they learn academic content through the medium of both languages. So they're not just learning the language for the language, although that's important. They're learning high levels of algebra. They're learning algebra through the medium of two languages, and they're learning United States history through the medium of two languages, for instance. So that level of academic language and literacy makes a difference, and it has strong positive implications and results in student learning outcomes.
So this brings us to the question of, well, okay, if a student enters the school system, they have to be evaluated first. Their language skills have to be evaluated, and then when they are in the school system, what do they have to learn? How is learning algebra in English or learning history in English different from just, well, learning the language?
Right. This is a key component, right? Because we could talk about different linguistic registers, but I think to simplify, the conversation a little, we do use the terminology academic language, academic literacies. Broadly speaking, academic language is all of that language associated with learning in schools, that's used in schools. I think specifically some scholars focus on academic language that includes low-frequency kinds of words or that have Greek and Roman roots. There's a lot of debate surrounding how we define academic language. But the important thing is that students can use sophisticated language. Their vocabularies are useful across all kinds of learning contexts in different contexts and using different linguistic registers, and that level of learning is different than just learning a second language, a foreign language, for instance, and just learning language itself. So you have the benefit of learning language, but when you have a highly prepared educator who, for instance, let's imagine a secondary physics teacher. A secondary physics teacher probably knows academic content about physics well, and can teach physics. But a strong secondary physics teacher who works with multilingual students also understands the language of physics and knows how to break down the language of physics in a way that multilingual learners also understand the language of physics. So it's not only the content, but it is the language of the content. And in this regard, our teachers for multilingual learners must be laser focused on the language of their academic content. That really makes a difference in the learning for multilingual learners.
And could you give an example of what this academic language to learn for the student would be? What kind of expressions they would have to learn?
Sure. We could think about maybe a simple mathematics question. If Mary, I have to think here quickly about it. If two students need 15 access to 15 automobiles and two-thirds of them are yellow, what percentage might be related to the color red? There's sort of the way language within an academic discipline. The way language is used, it differs a lot. So, for example, in mathematics, the syntactic structure is very complicated. Word problems in mathematics can be problematic for our second and multilingual learners who are not familiar with that genre or who are not familiar with the language of mathematics, and they need really to understand how to break apart those questions in order to answer them. They may know how to solve the problem. They may not know the syntactic structure of a word problem in mathematics. So again, a teacher who's teaching mathematics has to teach mathematics itself. We want students to be able to do solving the problems, but also laser focused on the language of mathematics and where it could be problematic for their multilingual learners.
Right, so the student has to understand the language of mathematics in order to understand the problem, right, and then to be able to solve it.
Right.
Right, okay. So we have been talking so far about different kinds of programs, starting with the most common, probably the inclusion classroom, and dual language two-way immersion programs. So why would the two-way immersion program be better for students?
Well, that's a good question. I think, ideally, when we look at the research, I think multilingual learners and students really benefit from programs where they can develop multiple languages. I mean, the research on this is just so clear. I think one of the problems we have is the public perception of bilingual programs and dual language programs, and I could talk a little bit more about that. But I think in part our field suffers from the public perception that the more this is sort of time on task idea. The more we give students the language that they need to learn, the easier they're going to learn it. So, for instance, let's say we're in Poland today, and imagine we have Ukrainian immigrants. I mean, the time on task thinking is that we give kids more access to Polish that come from Ukraine, and they'll learn Polish faster and better. And we know that that's not how it works for multilingual students, right? We know that time on task is really not the way that students learn most efficiently. What really helps them is building from the language they already know and continuing to build the language they already know and learning the other language and also being able to understand the relationship between those two languages. When we allow students the opportunity to continue to build their first language and transfer those skills across languages and build academic language in two or more languages, they actually do better. So the time on task idea has been challenged quite a bit in scholarly literature. I think, however, we suffer from the public perception that time on task, it's an easy solution, and in fact, it's more complicated than that. So I think that might maybe answer some of your question about the program types. But I just wanted to go back and clarify that there are other program types that people use and think about depending on the language resources of a community. So in some communities where not all teachers are prepared for multilingual learners, they may have a regular classroom and hire a bilingual staff member to go into the classroom and work with those students as a specialist. And that is also quite a common model that we see in the United States, and I think maybe in Europe as well. But increasingly, the access to bilingual programs is important. It's just that in some communities we don't have equitable access to linguistic resources in order to implement those programs effectively.
So what would you mean by linguistic resources?
Right. So I would want, for instance, to run a good bilingual program or to implement that, a couple of key things really have to happen. The first is absolutely working with families and the community. Families also need to understand that their children might be in a program where they're learning through two languages. And they may also think, my child is not getting enough Polish. I want my child only in Polish because my child doesn't need to learn Ukrainian, okay? But what we need to do as educators is to educate families about the benefit, the long-term, medium-term and long-term benefits of your child learning through multiple languages and developing literacy in those languages. So we have the community and the public and the families to sort of work with initially. But we also need to work with teachers to understand the commitment, their commitment and their professional development to ensure that the program model and those programs are working in a way that they should work. So, for instance, we want teachers to be linguistic resources. We want teachers to be highly prepared to teach through the medium of one language and maybe another educator through the medium of another language and to collaborate. We want teachers to understand how multilingual students learn. That is, they're learning all the time in these, the language they may be speaking might be English or might be Polish, but it's still their underlying cognition, their cognitive development is still occurring through two languages. So we want teachers to be able to tap into all of the linguistic resources of students. So I love it, for instance, when teachers are able to work with a multilingual learner and show the learner the relationship between Polish and Ukrainian, or the relationship between English and Spanish. Then our multilingual learners also learn that metalinguistic awareness, the meta language they need, the ability to choose across languages, the ability to transfer across languages. Those are very sophisticated, cognitively sophisticated tasks. And I think highly prepared teachers with strong linguistic resources can help multilingual learners be more confident and more nimble in their multilingualism.
So that's a new task for the classroom teacher to learn the language of their students. Okay, that's a hard task. Then some people might ask, okay, but why should all of this be financed from the taxpayers' money? Mm-hmm. So I believe this question has been asked recurrently in the United States, but it's probably relevant for teachers and education systems around the world. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Why should we pay for this? This is an important question because we know, I mean, we all enter the field of education because we love children. We love students. We believe in the work. We know that we have a great task ahead of us. But money does matter in education and in the quality of education. But let's just imagine that we have 50 students in a first grade classroom. And I know that all of my students will say, we want to develop a bilingual education program. I need 2 teachers. I need 2 teachers for 50 students. Or in Florida, we have 22, number of 22, so 44 students. So I need 2 teachers for 44 students. I could use a Spanish-speaking teacher and an English-speaking teacher. I still have 2 teachers. There's no additional cost to run. But now, there may be additional cost in access to curriculum, high-quality curriculum through 2 languages. I understand that. And there may be cost to teacher education along the way, leader education, counselors, and so on. And I really might need access to multiple assessments. So I understand how a student is performing in literacy, in reading and writing in Spanish, as well as how she's performing in reading and writing in English. I want to know that information. But I can tell you that the benefits far outweigh those small costs of adding an assessment and thinking about a multilingual curriculum. We know that students in strong bilingual programs that stay with dual language programs for 4 or 5 years, that stay throughout the primary education years, they outperform monolinguals. So what is the cost we're asking? If we know students do better, we know that their identities are affirmed, we know that their cultures are reified through the curriculum, we know that teachers are better prepared, so we have all of these positive benefits. I'd have to go back and ask, what is the cost again? Are we really talking about, we're not really talking about much here. And if we really believe in equitable education, and if we really believe in justice in education, we really believe in the call of education, then this is no cost to us at all.
So you're saying that there's hard research evidence that students in those bilingual programs do better than monolingual students?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we could make a list of some of the research, and I'm quoting years of research going back to one of the earlier studies in the 1990s from Virginia Collier and Wayne Thomas, the Thomas and Collier studies, as well as several meta-analyses that have been conducted in the United States, McField and Green and so on. So we have not only conducted the research in the United States, but also have 30 years of meta-analyses of research studies. So I wouldn't say that without really having studied that work myself and understanding the nuances in those programs. And there are caveats, right, like with education. But the research is there. And I hope that as we're in a very global environment, made very evident for us through the global pandemic, that we're able to share across those resources and really understand a more global multilingual world, that the reality of the multilingual world that we are actually living in.
Right. So this is the hard research evidence, and now let's switch to the perspective of an ordinary classroom teacher who has some immigrant students in the classroom, and what advice would you have to this teacher? What are they supposed to do?
Right, that's a good question. Because if teachers are not prepared originally, it's quite harrowing, right, to think about. I have a student and I have to teach a curriculum that I know I must teach because I want the students to do well and I want them to learn, but I can't communicate with the student. How do I do this? And it can be overwhelming at first, but I think that we have tools at our disposal, and we have to sort of take a step back and think about what's in front of us, ahead of us. For a student, first is really to think about the student at the center of instruction. So as an educator, I need to know a lot about that student before I can make an instructional decision. And I would say start there. First I would want to know, who is my student? How do I pronounce her name? How do I know where she's from? How do I know what languages she knows already? And I mean more than one, languages. And what are her literacy abilities in those languages? What does she love to learn? What does she love to read? What do her parents speak and use at home? Do they use multiple languages? They may use a different language for religious purposes than a language that they use for work purposes and so on. So I want to know those linguistic resources of the student first. And when the student comes in, I want to make sure that my instruction is really targeted to helping that student learn. That's my task. Whether the student initially can get to the standards and the curriculum I have, that's a different question. But right now, a new student coming in, I need to know about that student. And I also need to make sure that my classroom environment, my linguistic environment, reflects that student's identity. I want to make sure that if the student speaks Ukrainian, that I have, and can read and write Ukrainian, that I have materials in my classroom that the student sees that her language is important. Her family is important. Her culture is important. I want my classroom to reflect the multiple language resources of that student and family. So I want my classroom to be very welcoming. I want the student to feel that she is affirmed here and that I understand that she's got a task ahead of her and I'm on her, so I'm here to help. I'm here to be here with her. Now, I think there are lots of other things that happen in between, but initially I would say for a teacher, if you can start there, you're off to a good start. If you don't start there, I don't know how you are going to get to the curriculum that you know you need to teach, because you already haven't figured out your starting point. So just from there, I think is a good, and then we could talk about strong instructional practices from there.
Yeah, right. So after these things that happen at the beginning, then how to teach the curriculum to this student who doesn't know the language of the school, the language of instruction yet.
Right, this is really important. So first, I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that teachers need to understand what linguistic demands are coming from the curriculum for those students. So even at a lower primary level, there's language of school that is complicated language, and teachers need to see what that language is all about, and know where it can pose problems for their learners right away. So there's the idea of knowing the curriculum and knowing the language of the curriculum. And then sometimes, and teachers say this quite a lot, when students have come from refugee backgrounds with interrupted formal education, or interrupted learning because of moving and so on, and mobility issues, then they may not have access to that grade level curriculum in their first language. And teachers wonder, I had a teacher recently last year with the pandemic talk about how she was a fourth grade teacher, and she purposefully chose fourth grade because she didn't want to be responsible, for instance, for teaching the alphabet to students and teaching students how to write their names. But what she learned in fourth grade, especially with pandemic and interrupted education, was that she had to go back and teach those things. And this may be the case. If a teacher is teaching third grade, fourth grade, and a student comes in with interrupted education who doesn't understand the alphabet in Polish or the alphabet in English, then that teacher's teaching the alphabet to that student and is teaching early literacy skills to that student. That's part of it. That's laying a foundation for further learning, and that's part of grade level learning, the grade level placement of students that's appropriate. Then the teacher also needs to think about ways to differentiate her materials. So if she's teaching fourth grade, if she's teaching second grade seasons and the weather, for instance, right? That's a standard part of the curriculum. And she might need to figure out how to simplify the language of that curriculum and create materials that are accessible to the student. And this is where backing up, understanding what students can already do in their first language and knowing what they can do in their second language, Polish or English, matters. Because if I know, for instance, that I'm teaching second grade and I have a student who seems pretty proficient orally and can speak English pretty well, well, that's a really important data point for me. I know that I can speak with that student. But that student might not really have writing skills in English, that's grade level writing skills. That means I need to figure out what my student can do in writing. Might be different than oral language, than speaking, but in writing, and I need to figure out how I can differentiate my materials and break apart the language so the student can actually perform a task and demonstrate that she learned the content. That might mean not writing a paragraph, that might mean in second grade not writing 2 sentences. It might mean just drawing a line from an image, from one image to another, showing that she understands that this word means autumn, and she can point to the picture or draw a line to the picture. So because she might not have the writing ability yet, but she's learning the content. We have to start by building. We can't start by the curriculum at the grade level and expecting the student to get there. We have to start by the student, what the student can do in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then differentiate, get the student from this point to the next point. That's a big task, and it takes time, but that's really what teachers need to work on.
Okay, so once again, evaluate the skills the student has at different levels. And so these are the aspects of working with a student. But also some teachers, especially teachers of immigrant students, complain that the students seem not to care, they don't do the homework, the parents are not interested in how the child is doing at school. So there's a whole range of problems that a teacher is faced with. So could you comment on that? What about the students who would just not do the homework?
Right. This is also something we hear, maybe we share internationally, but teachers may not understand, may not know what's happening in the home, and there's a lot of assumptions around that. But I can say that in 35 or so years working with families in communities, I have not yet met a parent, particularly an immigrant parent, that said, I don't care about my child's education. In fact, the opposite happens, that we have parents that are so invested they actually will move from Central America and painstakingly travel thousands of miles to get to the United States in order to ensure that their child has access to education. As a way of social mobility. And so parents make tremendous sacrifices on behalf of their children. Sometimes parents separate from their children in order to provide for them what they feel that their child needs. So I think it's really the opposite is the more common. But I know that there are cultural differences surrounding what parents feel is their role in their child's education, as well as the role of the teacher in their child's education. So for instance, across, Latinx populations are not a monolith by any means in the United States. Latinos are as varied as any group around the world. But I could say that in my time working with Latino families, Spanish-speaking families in the United States, there's generally a sense that there's a high respect for the teacher and a very high regard for that person, so that the children are really socialized from the home to be very, very respectful of the teacher, And families and parents often feel that they can't be a replacement for a teacher. They don't know maybe the language. They may not have a strong educational background, formal educational background themselves, and so they don't feel sometimes equipped to help their child at home in homework. And so what the teacher may perceive to be a parent who doesn't care, in fact, is really a parent who cares so much and has respect for the teacher that they feel that they can't substitute for the work of the teacher. There could be clearly cultural differences in what it means to do homework or home learning. Many of our immigrant families feel underprepared in helping their child in a language that they themselves don't speak and use. So there could be some disconnect, right, between what the teacher's perception is and what the family perception is. As well as in the United States, immigrant families work very, very hard. They work multiple jobs. Our immigrant families in rural Florida work in agriculture, in the horsing industry, and cattle, and so on. And so sometimes they work several jobs. So for them to come home at night and help their child, or maybe they're expected to show up in the school for school meetings and parent-teacher meetings more frequently. Sometimes they just can't because they're working, and they might not have received, first of all, the information in a language they can read. That's a problem. And that's a problem of the school, right? To communicate with families in languages that they can read, write, and understand. But also, it may not be the most helpful time for families. So many families are so busy providing for their children that they're not able to get to the school to engage in some of these activities and events. So I think that we'd have to take a step back and look community by community, family by family, and understand what the expectation is on the part of the school and the teacher, and what families are really facing in their realities, and see how to build communication practices that are really much more culturally and linguistically sensitive and responsible to families than we have in the past.
So what can the teacher do to reach out to those families?
Right. Well, the very first thing is if a teacher is sending home information and materials in the language of the school and not in the language of the home, then that's that's just not going to work, right? The other thing is we sometimes don't remember that families, like children, have different literacy levels in different languages, and some families do not have print literacy. Ability to read and write, for instance, in Spanish or in another language. So even sending materials home in Spanish might not be appropriate. Or schools might think that the children are speaking and using Spanish at home, but they're speaking Canjobal or Mam or another indigenous language from Central America. So that's why, going back to what we said earlier, the child is got to be the center of decision making, and the family has to be at the center. So the language of communicating is essential, and then understanding the realities of what families are doing and their ability is also central. I also think schools often, when you just, if you were just to imagine walking up to a school, and when you look at the outside of a school building, what do you see? The name of the school, sometimes the number of the school. And then when parents or families come or people come to the front door, what do they see? They see the language of the school, right? Greeting, it might even say wear a mask, and it might be in Polish, or wear a mask might be in English. I think educators need to take a field trip to their own school, like a little mini trip, as if you were an immigrant family coming in, walking up. What would you change about the entrance of your school just to make sure that families are welcome there? If you could imagine color and pictures and language and drawings and things that would really welcome families in the languages that they use, that would go a long way to building family-school communication practices. And I think there would be a different response.
Okay, thank you very much. And one final topic for today.
Sure.
You're also an expert on education in rural contexts. So how is the rural context different from the urban context?
Right, that's a great question, because we haven't in the past 30 years paid enough, if any, attention at the intersection of rurality or place-based education and the multilingual learner. So this is an area, again, that we are really thinking and taking up academically and socially in the United States. But there are some very important differences. And first, let me say that the way education is funded in the United States is very different than my understanding of how, in general, it's funded in Europe or in many other countries. And by that I mean, and maybe listeners would be surprised to hear this, that in the United States, the federal government really only accounts for about 10% of a school's budget. That's very, very small. The rest, 85-90% of the budget, comes from state funds and from local funds. Local funds are derived from property taxes. Okay? So if the majority of your funding comes from property taxes, and you live in a community that is agriculture, where farmers pay very low tax, has very few homes because it's rural, and a lot of the land is taken up by churches that pay no tax, then your funding base for your rural schools is very, very different than funding for suburban schools where people live in expensive, lovely homes and pay more tax. So this is a structural inequity in U.S. education. And we have known this structural inequity for 50 years or more. I can go back and point to the work of, the wonderful scholarly work of Jonathan Kozol, for example, who explored this topic tremendously, and many others that work in school finance. So in the United States, the difference between rural schools and urban, and I don't mean to create a metrocentric urban rural, there's many more in between, but the difference between the way schools are funded and structured is really important. And I don't think that happens in most countries. I think in many, many countries around the world, education is financed centrally, and students who, irrespective of where they live, a certain amount of money is allocated for the schools. So that's one big difference. But the other big difference, I think, which is true, is in rural communities, there's less access to linguistic resources and less access to teacher education, in-service teacher education programs for multilingual learners. So, for instance, if you're in a rural community in the United States, and let's just imagine you're a secondary Spanish teacher. In a rural community, a secondary Spanish teacher might be the Spanish teacher, might be the ESL teacher, might be the family liaison and do the interpreting at a parent-teacher night. It may also be the person responsible for the technology in the school, that other colleagues go to for help. So rural communities, because of the low incidence numbers often of multilingual learners in those communities, and the disparity in linguistic resource, and the disparity in funding, of course, as a base, it creates a different structure for those learners. So we see vast differences in rural communities in terms of access to equitable programs for our multilingual learners than we do certainly in suburban and urban schools. And those are the things that we're paying attention to these days.
So thank you very much, Maria, for being with us today. We have mentioned a large number of different topics related to multilingual students and bilingual education. To sum up, we've talked about different programs, from inclusion programs to dual two-way immersion programs. We've talked about what happened to an immigrant student who enters the school system, how the student has to be evaluated first, and what they have to learn, that the student has to learn the academic language. And then we talked about the teacher's perspective, how the teacher can help the student, how the teacher can reach out to the family. And then finally, we talked about the backgrounds, the different communities that have multilingual students and also have differentiated resources to help those students. So thank you once again, Maria, for this very informative talk.
Thank you for having me.
And Maria is also an owner of a YouTube channel with lots of videos that our listeners might find, our viewers might find useful. So we're posting links to the channel and to some of the interesting videos. Okay, enjoy.